When we're talking about change management, clearly what happens within an organization is there is a tension that occurs. The term is actually creative tension, and it's that tension between today and tomorrow. Tomorrow being our vision. It's what do we want? What do we care about? What are we going to put our energy into? And today is what's really happening right now. And there's a lot of stuff we don't know, and there's a lot of stuff that we need to learn. And unfortunately, when you're going through a strategy change, or you're trying to transform an organization, you have to do these two things at the same time. You have to live in today and tomorrow. We used to call that the two trains running. You had to keep both of them running quickly, and both had to be on time, if you will. So while you're changing, you're actually still operating in today's world, and it does create some anxiety, no doubt, which is really important for people to know that there is a vision out there and there is a destination out there. And it is also important for people to know that it's not that they as individuals are not the only ones who don't know exactly how we're going to get there. Um, Generally, from a communication standpoint, people absorb information over differently over time. They go through stages. Stages meaning they become aware of change. Something is happening, and it's just kind of out there. And then it gets more specific. Then there might be some questioning about details. Wanting more information, what's going on here, and then the inevitable is how does it affect me? How is this going to play out? Over time, those details will get communicated more and more so. And once people understand that massive changes are happening, whether it be some jobs going away or some jobs changing, or whatever it becomes, they'll want to know who's in charge, and how is this getting managed. Is there a timetable, if you will? And then once the future parameters are set and a new organization is in place, how do we know who stays and who goes? How is it going to be evaluated? How based on individual performance or future competencies that might be required in the organization, right? So another thing would be the use, how it's coordinated amongst various groups, and inevitably, what will happen was things will come up where there will need to be constant re-looking at the change plan, re-looking at alternatives and tweaking plans as you go along. I mean, it's impossible to know everything all the way up front. But in terms of keeping a strategy around what to communicate when, stages of concern is a pretty good model to kind of phase in over time. Uh, Another aspect of change, this is something which I always found extremely interesting, was this idea of what do we mean by how innovation moves throughout an organization. This little chart here, you may have seen this in the Everett Rogers book on diffusion of innovation. You also, this was sort of captured sort of in a more crystallized, simple way in Malcolm Gladwell's work in The Tipping Point. But it basically starts out with innovation. There's someone who might have an innovation that they're considering. So, for example, back in the '90s, there was some, may not have even been that short a time ago, but big trucks and big, you started to see people going down the Jeep format and getting these like really rustic looking vehicles. But they were kind of ugly, and what would happen if you went into a rich neighborhood and had all these beautiful houses, and then somebody would be putting up an ugly tank, in front of their house, park it in front of their house, and it would sort of be an eyesore, right? So while the person is being innovative on the one side, on the other side it may be cause for concern by the general public. Somehow somebody might look at that and say, hey, that's a pretty good idea. Maybe if I took that ugly tank thing that's sitting in the driveway over there and I put a nice coat of paint on it and maybe some leather seats and maybe put in a good stereo system, maybe I could make that more palatable for me. And that would be an example of turning the ugly thing, the unacceptable thing, into, at the time, that was a Hummer. Hummers became so popular. And once these Hummers started popping up, and then all of a sudden more and more started popping up. So the person who made the adjustments is actually the early adopter, if you will, is actually a translator of an innovation. That's the person who makes it acceptable to move an innovation forward and acceptable to the majority population. And the majority phases in terms of early majority, late majority. I'm sure you've seen this in your marketing classes over time. Connectors come in different forms. So one type of a translator is a connector. And the connector, you'll know these people when you see them. They just know a lot of people. They have lots of social contacts, and they're the ones that have access to a lot of people. If this person is an early adopter, this person will spread the word just naturally. It's just who they are. It's how they do things. The opposite of that would be the maven. The maven may not necessarily be as sociable as, say, the connector would be, but that person is recognized as somebody who has a wealth of knowledge, is actually sought out. So people come to the maven. And so by design, the maven knows a lot of people. And if the maven becomes the early adopter, then many other people now that person gives access to the larger majority. And there are some people who are just love talking up ideas. They just enjoy, selling ideas and, talking to people. These natural salespeople. And, whether they're connected to people or not, they have a tendency of being able to get the word out, if you will. So they're kind of exciting. And again, we're calling this idea the diffusion of innovation. This is very, very useful to know because this is what happens inside of organizations. Think about it this way. The formal organization, management from the top, they put a change in place, a new strategic plan, and they're pushing it top down into the organization. Anybody who works in any kind of an organization knows that the formal organization plays a very important role in terms of management, but there's also an informal organization that gets things done. There are people out there who may not have a heck of a lot of authority, but they're the ones who can push messages and sell things. These folks are part of the informal organization. And in your communications plan, you're going to have to figure out ways to hit these early adopters. You may not even know who they are. You may not know what their names are because they might be too low in the organization for you to ever have met them. But they're there, and they are really in large part responsible for helping things succeed in your change plan. So they must be taken into consideration. They will help move the message positively, or if you're not careful, they can be the ones who can hold your change plan and strategy back from actually occurring. They can be barriers. So moving on from here, Peter Senge actually took this idea of the diffusion of innovation, and he created a really wonderful step-by-step approach to how do I develop a change plan, and how do I phase it in. So I'm going to show you something right here. So the first phase of a change plan is the initiation of change. In stages of concern language, that might be the awareness stage. So what happens is the immediate reaction to we're going to make a change is we don't have time to do this. We have too much on our plates. So a good strategy in first step in your change plan is to start to build the from to and show that there are some initiatives that we've done in the past that will be part of the future. Building in meeting time, unstructured time to discuss what the change might look like. Very important up front. You may need to find ways to build different uses of time inside organizations, and this has to come from the top. Building in this unstructured conversation time, often referred to as dialogue. Important to set that up front. Once that happens in this initiation phase, there's the whole, well, we have no help. How are we going to get this done? We got too much on our plate. And change leaders, people who are in charge of a change plan, need to know that they have to predict over the course of a whole strategic change. They have to predict how much help, how much mentoring, how much coaching, how much management is required over the course of the timeline. And that needs to be part of the investment in the change plan, is getting those help structures in place. Other things that Peter pointed out in the initiating change part is people seeing this stuff is not relevant. I know I recall quite some time ago when I had to implement new processes around new technologies. Like when we went from no internet to having an internet, and people would see it for the first time, and they would see these databases and websites, and they would say, this stuff doesn't make any sense. It doesn't. What has this got to do with what my job is, etc. So it does take time to sort of sell the idea of the strategic plan, to make not only leaders in the field aware of this, but to start to connect the dots for them about where we're headed, and making sure when you explain things and you train them on new initiatives that are always connected to the metrics that we talked about in an earlier session. And of course, walk the talk. You can't be having senior leaders or even mid-sized leaders sort of poo-pooing the idea about this change. It's very important that we're constantly communicating about the positive nature of this change. It's going to go forward, etc. So it's very important. Resistance in these cases is futile. The change is going to occur one way or another. Either the change is going to go forward and people are going to succeed, or the organization will cease to exist. Second phase is sustaining the transformation. So this is when you need to deal with the vulnerabilities. This is what the stages of concern, when they talked about the dealing with the personal aspects of it. People are going to start to get testy. But this is where you can point out to people to say, you do have some of the skills that are going to be required in the new organization, and be open to listening to people, and let them be afraid and let them vent, so you can understand where they're coming from, and make a big deal over first downs, not always touchdowns, right? Make a big deal that little things that are moving the organization forward are very, very helpful. Assessment and measurement is very critical. You may need to throw ideas in the mix about how to measure the change that's happening. You may have to come out with new measures. You may need to assess things differently. Companies like YouTube have just done this, where they went through their strategic change. So what did they do is they went from clicks on YouTube to people enjoying the experience on YouTube. A click might be somebody was on the site for a couple of seconds. An experience means they saw the entire video. And that changed the strategic way that they thought about things at YouTube. Of course, when their metrics changed, people's performance were recalibrated. The idea of being bicultural is so critical. If you're on a project team assigned to making change happen, the language that you're deploying needs to be different when you're within your project team versus when you're not in your project team. The project team has gone all the way out front and has been talking about change over and over and over and over, and you know the language and you're close to the change. When you're outside, they haven't been able to hear the same things that you're hearing, so you have to go back to where they are, their point of departure, which is different from yours. In terms of continuing to think about rethinking and moving forward, whatever it is you come up with, a governance plan is really required. What are the new rules? How do we measure performance? How do we handle complicated situations? What is acceptable behavior, not acceptable behavior? What are the measures of success, etc. Very important. So your policy manuals need to change. Your performance systems need to change. Constantly, when we talked about diffusion of innovation, constantly keep looking at the conversation. What are all the connections? The idea in your readings around appreciative inquiry. Keep listening to people. What questions are they asking? How can you create more translators by just listening and giving people a chance to express themselves so that you can join with them together to move things forward. And like in the stages of concern, strategy and purpose always must be revisited. Once you're through the 3-year plan, you may need to have another 3-year plan. So you're always taking that time to continue your scenario planning, and you're thinking about the future and what's 10 years out and how can we reshape our capabilities, and constantly doing that. And the more you're upfront and communicate about your strategic plans and your change plans, the more quickly you're going to be getting buy-in from throughout your organization. I'm going to leave it like this and look forward to our discussions in our classroom setting at this point. Thank you for listening.